first one to admit I was definitely on the Auburn bandwagon going into this season, and rightfully so. I mean, they did a phenomenal job with the transfer portal this year. They brought in Cam Coleman. They brought in Jackson Arnold. They brought in a number of different guys also on the defensive side of the ball too. And they had also a lot of young talent too, like Jeremiah Cobb, who I believe was incredibly underutilized. But now fast forward after the excruciating 10-3 loss versus Kentucky, and now Auburn is essentially in the same situation that they were, the previous 2 years ago under Brian Harsin, where they fired him, and now they're going to be paying a combined $52.5 million to Gus Malzahn, to Brian Harsin, and to now Hugh Freeze. And I mean, it's one of those things where hindsight's always 2020, right? But at the same time, too, it made a lot of sense at the time to hire Hugh Freeze. Granted, you were taking a risk given his history and whatnot too, but at the same time, he did earn his stripes again. He did win at Liberty. He did have the experience of the SEC, and obviously he beat Nick Saban twice too. So I mean, it made sense as to why they kind of took a chance on Hugh Freeze in that way. But I guess Auburn's been kind of always fascinating in terms of their head coaching hires, especially if you go back to the days of Tommy Tuberville and whatnot too. But nevertheless, I mean, you're always hearing so many different narratives as to why Hugh Freeze at Auburn hasn't worked out. And I've seen some fascinating takes, needless to say. I think one that I heard a couple days ago was that the team didn't really believe in Hugh Freeze anymore. And I'll be the first one to tell you that is completely inaccurate. I think it was more or less that just the overall scheme itself just wasn't necessarily working. I don't think the locker room quit on Hugh Freeze. I don't think that it's not that he's not a good recruiter. I think the reality is that he was just simply betting on the wrong quarterbacks. And what I mean by that is, you think of the season before where he was fluttering back and forth between Peyton Thorne and Hank Brown, and who, Peyton Thorne that was his senior year. Then Hank Brown transferred to Iowa soon after, the year after. And then now fast forward, you have Jackson Arnold, who in many ways kind of has a similar skill set to Peyton Thorne, in the sense that, he's athletic, he can use his feet to get out of the pocket. But at the same time, it is noteworthy to question his ability as a thrower. And at the same time, that's ultimately Hugh Freeze's Achilles heel. And granted, too, I do want to mention this. This isn't just me completely shitting on Hugh Freeze here. It's worth pointing out that not only is Auburn the most difficult job within the SEC, but I would argue it's the most difficult job perhaps even in the country. Because think about it, you're smacked in between Alabama and Georgia, who have been two of the most consistent college football programs within the past decade. You face Alabama in the Iron Bowl every year, and not to mention you're in the gauntlet of the SEC, who has recently added Texas and Oklahoma as of 2 seasons ago. So not only are you competing with all these regional schools, but you play in the toughest conference in all of college football. And you also have the expectations of the Georgias and the Alabamas every year, simply because you're there. But at the same time, too, I mean, Auburn is a beautiful place, and there's a reason why coaches go there. I mean, they give you the resource that you need to succeed. The fan base is incredibly loyal and passionate. I'll give them that. But Auburn really has to get this right in terms of their next head coaching hire. And, obviously, Hugh Freeze, he went 15-19 in his tenure, 6-16 within the SEC. I go back and over the past couple years, and I think of some of those upsets that he had. I think of that game versus New Mexico State. I think of Cal at the beginning of the season in 2024. I think of Vanderbilt, Mississippi State, and most recently Oklahoma as well. Now, granted, I think Auburn did get screwed in a couple of those games, particularly the Oklahoma game. I think the refereeing has not been kind to Auburn this season. And, even when I kind of look at the schedule for this year, when I first watched them play Baylor week 1, my initial thought was I think Auburn's going to be all right here. They won 38-24. They played a relatively complimentary game, but at the same time too, you also kind of look back on it as you kind of saw Jackson Arnold's progression and as you kind of saw how Auburn was going to show up offensively, is that Hugh Freeze talked a lot in the offseason press conferences about confidence and patience and making sure that his quarterback is comfortable. And I think he, in some ways, was trying to learn from his mistakes last year. However, at the same time, it's one of those things where you simply can't, even if maybe there is a truth about his players not playing to their ability, or maybe they did screw up in a critical moment, right? But at the same time, you can't go to the media and just completely shit on your team. And to some degree, I think that's kind of something that I think is getting kind of lost in this conversation about Hugh Freeze, as much as I think he deserves credit for, the recruiting job that he did, as much as he deserves credit for the talent that he's brought in. And also, not to mention, too, bring in DJ Durkin, who I've said it on this show before, even when I talked about Auburn a couple weeks ago. In my opinion, one of the best defensive coordinators in the entire country, and somebody who I think deserves another head coaching opportunity sooner than later. But nevertheless, I mean, that defense has kept him in so many games this year. I mean, whether you want to go back and talk about Georgia a couple weeks ago, the game versus Texas A&M, Oklahoma, and it's not like Auburn's necessarily getting spanked necessarily. These are all one-score games, but at the same time too, when towards the beginning of the season, you were able to get Jeremiah Cobb going a little bit more, and versus Arkansas, he had 153 yards, 111 yards, but I think the reality of the situation was, Auburn had one of the most stacked quarterback rooms in the entire country. You have Jackson Arnold, you have Ashton Daniels, who was sensational at Stanford last year, and you also had Deuce Knight too, who's a kid who has a ton of talent. And I think a lot of Auburn fans were certainly curious how he would have played too. But I think the reality is that a couple of different things. I think first and foremost, I think Hugh Freeze was just too patient with Jackson Arnold, and by the time the writing got on the wall, Ashton Daniels kind of came in and really didn't look very comfortable out there. I think I think that is a part of it. I think number two is that offensive line simply really was completely lackluster this year, and it's very similar to kind of what Jackson Arnold was facing in Oklahoma even last year, where he just never seemed very confident, very comfortable within the realms of being in the pocket. The second these SEC defensive lines were able to contain the pocket, it just seemed like that Jackson Arnold couldn't really make them pay for it. And, when you do have the Eric Singletons of the world and the Cam Colemans of the world and Jeremiah Cobb and all these other offensive weapons, it's just, you just have to find a way to make that work. And I get it. Like I said a couple seconds ago, Auburn is one of the toughest places to play in the country. And, they play a gauntlet of a schedule every year. They've played four ranked teams back aside from Arkansas and Kentucky. However, when push comes to shove and you're kind of sitting at this team, they're just kind of at a pass right now because Auburn hasn't had a winning season since 2020. The offensive issues, it's not just this season, it's also last season. In Auburn's 22 SEC games under Hugh Freeze, 17 of those games, they scored 24 points or less. So, and it just gets to a point where you could only have the same narrative so many more times over and over and over, because, at the same time, when they signed Hugh Freeze that contract back in, what was it, 2022, it was 6 years, $39 million. And, unfortunately, it's just one of those things where I think Auburn just decided, hey, we're gonna try and be proactive here and kind of cut bait before it just gets too out of hand. And despite the success on the recruiting trail, despite the kind of success or hinting of success, let's say, the reality is that it just simply wasn't going to come together, and Hugh Freeze simply wasn't maximizing the weapons that he had, and it was quite evident that perhaps it maybe wouldn't have gotten better, because when you look at Auburn's 2026 recruiting, for example, their class up to this point was only 14 guys so far, and it was on track to be their worst recruiting class since 2010. So it's definitely an unfortunate end to Hugh Freeze, because I would have liked to see him succeed at Auburn. I think he is a guy that, he has a unique background in high school and within the SEC, and and his chops just as an offensive guru, let's say. However, I think this Auburn job was just a little bit too overwhelming for what he was trying to accomplish. But at this point in time, I think a lot of pressure is going to be on Auburn to really get this one right, considering that you got the last two wrong. And, again, like I said before, Auburn has all the weapons to succeed. It's such a unique place, and I would love to see somebody win there. I think if you're Auburn, they probably have to go all in on John Summerall. However, if Kentucky comes calling for John Summerall, I think it's going to put Auburn in a really fascinating spot, because with so many different head coaching opportunities open right now, it's just everything's just getting so saturated in terms of there's only so many top guys who are going to be there. And now that Rhett Lashley, Matt Rule, and Kurt Signetti are all off the board, it's going to be really fascinating to kind of see where Auburn goes from here.